Good morning, everybody. My name is Bob Conway, and I am the organizer for this meetup group. We call it Data Modeling, Architecture, and Integration. And I think the title is sort of self-explanatory in terms of the types of topics that we cover. We meet once a month for an hour, usually the first Monday of the month at 9 o'clock Mountain Time. We've had to adjust it to the third Tuesday or whatever, second Tuesday this month because of some of our panelists' schedules and conflicts. Also today, we're going to go for an hour and a half. We're actually going to go about 90 minutes on the recording because I think the topic we're covering, as someone said in our planning session, when it comes to data lakes and data mesh and data fabric, we could spend an hour talking about any one of those things. I agree. And in fact, we may do that in some of our subsequent sessions. But for now, I want to talk about the three of those in context together. So I expanded it out to 90 minutes. Our format today, rather than a formal presentation, is going to be more of a panel discussion, and I'm going to moderate. I'll have the panelists introduce themselves in just a second. And a last administrative question or remark I wanted to make. Due to my own travel schedule and the holidays and whatnot, we will probably not have a December meeting. So we'll take it up again after the first of the year. There will be an announcement on topic and speaker and whoever, okay? So let's get into today's topic. I was a little bit cutesy with the Wizard of Oz theme and called it Data Lakes and Meshes and Fabrics. Oh my, lions and tigers and bears. Data warehousing's been around for 30 years or so, and it's a fairly mature architecture in most medium to large size organizations. But of recent, there's a lot of discussion about some complementary or alternative ways of approaching the whole business of business intelligence and analytics. Data lakes has been around probably 8-10 years. The topic of data mesh came about probably in the last year or two, and more recently data fabrics. And a lot of the discussions I've heard, people are asking exactly what is it? Is a fabric the same as a mesh? Is it different? Should I be doing both or neither? I'm doing this instead of a data warehouse, or how I do it. I'm hoping to pull a comb through some of that confusion this morning with our panelists here. And I'm going to basically take it in a two-step approach. I'm going to ask each of them to go around and pick one of these topics and just give us a rigorous definition of what we mean by that concept. Is it an architecture? Is it program management? What the heck is it? And somewhat without advocacy or criticism or whatever, just a plain old definition. And that'll probably take us the first 20 or 30 minutes. The remainder of the time, I'm going to ask our panelists to talk about the applicability of these in today's world. What's good about it? What's bad about it? What are some of the challenges, the opportunities, et cetera? Okay. As far as the non-panelist participants, if you have questions along the way, put them in the chat session, and I'll be keeping an eye on that while we're going forward. I will leave about 10 minutes at the end for verbal Q&A from the panelists, from the audience at large. But with that, I want to introduce our panelists and then jump right into the topic. So starting with Jay, can you give us a little 30-second of who Jay Allen is and what you've been doing for the last 10, 20, 30 years and your interest in this topic?
Backgrounds in software development, started in the late 1980s, was originally a data person, but really got into it more when I learned about this new thing called data warehousing. For me, it was about the mid to late 90s. It had been around for a few years. And I've been doing that mostly ever since, data integration, data ontology for companies. And I was still interested after all that time, still interested in the subject.
Great. John, can you go next?
Sure. I'm John O'Brien, Radiant Advisors. We're primarily a research-backed advisory firm for companies that help with very specifically building their data strategies and the architecture roadmaps to go with it. So we're always evaluating, different pseudo architectures like Fabric, like Mesh, a lot of data lake work. And of course, it was all built on data warehousing and BI and then later big data. Been in the space about 35 years, building warehouse like Jay, late 80s, early 90s, and continuously since then.
Thanks, John. And Steve?
Yes, this is Steve Dine. I work with a company called EXL. We focus on, in fact, we're probably the largest pure play analytics, advanced analytics and data management consulting organization globally. I've been in data management and BI for over the last 25 plus years, probably over 30 years, but I don't want to sound as old as John. I've worked in nearly all the different areas of data management and BI, from architecture through data pipelines and ETL, through analytics. And I'm looking forward to this discussion today.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So let's jump right into it. We sort of drew straws earlier, so I'm going to ask Jay to start us off and talk about what do we mean when we say a data lake? What is that? How is it different from the plain old data warehouse? What is a data lake house? Is it different than data lake? Is it the sum of the two? Just take a few minutes and talk about what we mean by those things, okay?
Yeah, sure. So I had some slides from a presentation I did a few years ago at a federal agency, and I've kind of taken a few of those out. We're not going to go through the whole thing because I'm going to try to keep this to about 5 minutes. And as we were saying earlier, we're just going to try to stick to order definition. So I'm just going to jump around a little bit on this. So in terms of history of where it comes from, it's just a little more than a decade old. It's usually attributed to who was the CTO, I think, of Pentaho at the time, around 2011, James Dixon. I think there was PricewaterhouseCoopers was also famous for some quote they said about ending silos. So as a name, that's about how old Data Lake is. In terms of the technology, which is what I want to get to and what it really is, that is a different thing, and all of this is abstracted. We use so many terms, which is why we're having this presentation, right? We use so many terms in our industry. Sometimes you can be using something and doing something for years, and you don't really have an understanding of what it is under the hood. So this next part of the presentation was what do vendors say, and I'll jump around a little bit and go through all that for you. This is what all of the vendors of today's, the things you're familiar with today as data lake, this is what the vendors are calling it. Now, I'm not going to criticize that or anything. Now, where did it all start? Like I said, under the hood, we're really talking about a technology, and I'm going to sum that up in just a little bit. But it's, of course, started about 15 years ago with Hadoop, and that's where it all come. And these companies were using, well, let me be careful about how I say that, using this to replace some aspects of analytics when the big data kind of revolution or whatever came along. So Hadoop is the origins of this, and that was my first experience having a data lake. Actually, was Hadoop. Now I want to get down to the underneath, and this is kind of the end. This is where the real definition is to me. There's a little history which I'm going to share with everyone. This whole thing slides when I get it cleaned up, and I'll have a lot of links and things if you want to do a deeper dive on this. But there's a little evolution of the disk in media storage that comes along, starts even earlier than data lake, going back to the 1990s, and that's with block and object storage. And real quickly, the difference, file storage is what we're all accustomed to, is a hierarchical thing. You have a UNC path in a file name to locate a file. With block and object storage, there is none of that. There is no hierarchy, even though we do data modeling, hierarchical data modeling in those systems. That's not the way the hardware abstraction works. It only identifies by an object ID, and that's the only thing you have. So to sum up there, this is going to be, for me, the definition. It is most of what we have today that we consider to be data lakes. Their object storage. And of course, this is spread across multiple disks and multiple zones, and everyone here that's worked with that is set up and used something like Amazon S3 or Azure Blob storage. And today, some folks are even saying Databricks is the data lake today. That there is no, that it's assumed the definition itself. Now that's just one vendor, of course, so I'm not going to say that. But I will say, I think that what we have is a technology. I'm trying very hard not to say any opinions. It's all based around the evolution of storage and, of course, parallel processing. And I don't know how many minutes I'm in there, but I'm going to stop here because I want to hold back and get some feedback, and then we'll do a little deeper dive. But that's basically our definitions, is what the vendors call it. What I'm calling it for you is functionally, it's no different than file systems that we're all accustomed to. It's just a little different hardware and a different abstraction and way to get to them. Different performance characteristics, of course, and that was, part of the move to it as well. But again,
Okay.
let me stop there for a moment for you, and we'll start with that definition.
Okay, thanks, Jay. John, would you like to take Jay's definition and expand on it or add to it, or do you have a different perspective on some things? Take a minute or two and talk about data lakes from your perspective.
Yeah, I'm quite active in the data lake space, and one of the things that comes to data lakes, and if you remember when they did come out like 8 years ago with Hadoop, there was a lot of backlash. There was the data swamps and all this other data dumps, and people were using that term. And that's because when you have a straight up object store, you put all your data in there, and just imagine your nested file structures on your shared drives. Nobody could find anything. Nobody knew how to trust anything. So organizing and managing that, having an architecture within your data lake became key for data management. So I think that we had the capability, the technical challenge of being able to store everything was resolved, but it then launched the next technical challenge of how do we manage it? How do we organize our data? How do we secure it? Which then gave rise to the data catalogs, knowledge graphs, and the topic I drew, which was the fabric. So this is the hottest question as an inquiry from all our clients. Do I put my data lake inside of a database or inside of an object store? I won't go down that rabbit hole, but I would say that technically, a lot of us think of architecture as components inside of an architecture, but just because we're able to store it, the data management and organization so that somebody can actually use it and actually feel confident to make a decision was the next challenge that followed data lakes, and is very, very active today. Throwing security governance, and that's where I spend a lot of work.
Appreciate it, John. And I do want to go down that rabbit hole, but I'm going to keep that for our second half when we dig it in more detail.
Sure.
But from a definitional standpoint, Steve, would you add anything to what Jay and John have said in terms of what do we mean when we say data lake?
I don't think so. I think they've covered it fairly well. I mean, there's obviously debates as to how different a data lake is from the architectures of data warehouses we built in the past. Whether we've taken some components that we still do, like staging areas, and where we load raw data into, and we could, I suppose, call those data lakes. From an architectural standpoint, I would say from a logical architecture standpoint, physically maybe we can differentiate based on the technology we're using today. But no, I think Jay and John have covered it very well.
Yeah, I'll just add definitionally, I use the term enterprise repository of all data assets. For me, it's the data foundation in which we can now support multiple use cases between data warehouse, self-service, and data science projects. So it's really driven by a lot of reusability, which is what we look for in a logical architecture.
Okay, real good. And from my 2 cents, when I try to do a cocktail party explanation of what it is, particularly when talking to people who are already familiar with a traditional data warehouse. What I usually try to say is it isn't not a data warehouse. Rather, it's an augmentation of what you traditionally think of, relational data structures from ERP systems and so forth as sources. What I usually say is it's an augmentation of that with additional non-relational data, with unstructured data, if you will, spreadsheets, videos, audio files, those things that don't lend themselves to rows and columns. It's an attempt to bring that data together into a single environment. So anyway, I'll throw that out as my own perspective.
There's one thing that I was going through my notes. One of the things I was trying not to say is opinion, but now I will.
Okay.
There's no semantic consistency across a file system, right? Even if it's object storage. So one thing that I've seen folks do is actually use a relational database to keep a metadata database of what they're storing in S3 or Azure Blob or Hadoop or whatever. So that's one of the issues that, when I talk about the difference between database and data lake, to be sure, there's even though we have analytical tools and things that are supplied to us that come along with it, Databricks being a good example of this, it still doesn't have all of the management, we'll call this the management of a database management system, right? Traditionally. Yeah. So it's missing a lot in terms of actually organizing and managing data and going and finding it, as it's already been stated. So that's always what I refer to as the lack of semantic consistency. And you don't have it; you have to develop it yourself. Exactly.
And as John said, without the metadata, all you have is a bunch of files out there where nobody can find anything. I always drew that analogy as a library without a card catalog system is just a building full of books, right? And of course, all the millennials are going, what's a card catalog? But that's for another day.
What's a library?
Yeah, what's a library? Exactly. Let's move on. And Steve, I'm going to ask you to now take the topic of data mesh, and from a definitional standpoint, what do we mean when we talk about that? What is it? Is it an architecture? Is it a data planning mechanism? Is it complementary to or competitive with some of these other topics we're talking about? Take a few minutes and raise our level of understanding of what we mean by that phrase.
Will do. And I'll try my best to stick with the firm guidelines of not including opinion, but unfortunately, the definition is consistently evolving. So I'll have to add a little bit of opinion because the definition isn't necessarily locked in stone at this point. But data mesh is, it's really a decentralized approach, not an architecture, but an approach to sharing, accessing, managing analytic data within or across organizations. And it's really based on 4 principles. The first is domain-oriented distribution of data ownership and architecture. And when we talk about domain ownership, in the true, what I'll call definition by Zemek, domain ownership, and Zemek Delgani is really the creator, I'll call it, of the data mesh, or the initiator of it. And really, domain ownership was really from a product domain standpoint is how she really defined it. But in our world of data management, we've really moved that to more of functional, what I call functional domain ownership. Functional domains like accounting or HR or finance, or excuse me, or purchasing or supply chain. And that's because we're mainly working with, or not mainly, but also working with organizations that aren't high tech organizations built around products per se. Second, the data as a product is how it's defined, and really it's looking at data as something that is solving a particular problem, but also has value associated with it. Something that we should always be focused on, but that's the second principle of data mesh. The third is that it include a self-service platform, and we could talk more about that throughout this discussion, but a platform where both creators and owners of the data, as well as consumers and governors, can all interact in one distributed platform that's self-service. Lastly, that governance is federated. What Zemek calls federated computational governance, but really what she's referring to is governance that's both automated from a computational perspective, but also distributed across domains. Architecturally, it really shifts from collecting data in what we just discussed and talked about, data lakes and data warehouses, to really connecting data through distributed mesh of data products, or what software engineers like to call services or microservices that are accessed through standardized protocols. It also assumes that data requests can be delivered much faster by removing the bottlenecks of having one centralized data management organization that serves the requests of the organization, but rather moves it to the domains where the domain owners that assumably know more about their data because they work with that data on a daily basis and also understand the subject area very well, can take a data request and serve it much faster, since they're already working with that data and delivering them as data products. I'll stop there because I've said quite a bit, and Bob will let you sort of ask questions based off that.
Yeah, I will. I had a couple of questions, but let me give John and Jay or Jay a chance to disagree, embellish, qualify what Steve has said from a data mesh standpoint. John, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I have lots of mesh conversations with clients, and I'm actively working on at least 2 different data mesh implementations. And so what I'll say is, at the heart of it is this centralized versus distributor, decentralized kind of approach. Whenever an organization struggles with a central hub, an enterprise warehouse, a consistent definition among all the organizations, you start to, what's going to happen naturally is they're going to go decentralized and do it themselves anyway. So domain-driven development is great. And it works well in like finance and HR, where nobody's going to argue with finance what the definition of a GL is. And so that makes definitions easier. But once you start to move into some of the, I need a consistent definition across organizations, that's where you have to rely on, your trade-offs in this case are going to be in that kind of federated governance approach. So that's at the heart of it. And when I'm talking to companies that say, hey, should we do this or not? You have to really look at the organization's capability to work inside of that kind of organizational model. Do they have distinct lines of businesses and they're already aligned that way? Do they have distinct functional groups and they're already organized that way? That usually, when you already see a problem where we can't agree, we have a bottleneck problem, we're kind of stuck, and then you say, hey, go independently, that usually, means that the mesh is the right approach. The last thing I'll just add real quick is that I think Zemek's done a great job of really defining mesh the way we should look at it today within the context of data products. But this approach, I was just trying to count the calendars, like Steve said, I'm way too old, but I was doing this almost 20 years ago. And since then at companies, because the problem always existed, back then we actually referred to it ourselves, not a brand, but we called it the franchise model. Right? You wanted some consistency in architecture, naming and standards and governance, but you wanted each one of the franchises to work at their own independence and priority. So it's evolved. It has roots going back pretty far for us in the industry, but The mesh is the latest kind of definite, and it's really been updated for the data product kind of world we live in today. So it's nice, but that's how we have conversations about whether to mesh or not.
Okay. And Jay, you have anything quick to augment?
Yeah,
Stephen's
nothing to
kind
add
of
really.
said?
I would just reiterate, the difficulty in defining something that constantly changes. And for those that are old enough to remember, data warehouse as a term was introduced late 80s, early 90s, and by the end of the 90s, it meant several different things. But I think that doesn't prohibit us from talking about, because I'm with Steve's original. He's basically quoting from the book, the major tenets, and I think that's what we can talk about in terms of definition, is just going to the source.
Okay, I've got a couple of drill down questions, but I think I'm going to hold those for the second half of our discussion, where we talk about the applicability of these concepts. Okay, so again, real quick, John, can you just give us a 3 to 5 minute definition of what we mean by this concept when we refer to data fabric, and if you want to, compare and contrast to lakes and meshes and things we've talked about already, that's fine. In the next half hour, we're going to start mulling some of these ideas together. Take it from there, John.
Yeah, so I drew the short straw on fabric, and by short straw, I mean I won. The fabric is probably my most interesting and favorite topic these days. So what is a fabric? And then I'll get into how it's different than mesh and stuff, and how it incorporates lakes. To me, data fabric is really focused on, let's call it advanced data management. The heart of fabric is to solve those things that we find challenging inside of data management, both on the consumer side as well as the management side, the integrations and things that we do there. So when you look at the challenges that we have been faced with in the last 5-10 years, we have more data sets than we've ever had before, and we probably ingested them into lakes, and they've gone off to spin off into other data products. We are looking always to improve our efficiency around data delivery, which means we analyze the delivery kind of pipeline. And there's definitely, I've seen, other analyst firms talk about 70 and 80% efficiency gains from leveraging a data fabric. And then the other thing we can do is break down, these data silos, whether they're existing or the ones we may choose to build within domain-driven data meshes. And a fabric is a way to kind of integrate all of our data across multi-cloud, disparate heterogeneous technologies and databases, object storage databases, cloud 1, cloud 2, on-prem, and really give the users a single pane of glass. Now, that sounds pretty straightforward. We can say that's virtualization, but data virtualization is really one component within a fabric. The other component that is pretty equally important in there are the data catalogs, right? So when you get into the data lakes and all of this kind of sprawl we've had in the data explosion, finding data, understanding data, knowing if it's applicable, how it's governed, all of this is really the key within a fabric's trying to short circuit that, so we don't spend days and weeks trying to do that stuff, and we can spend hours and days on that. But I would say the way to imagine data fabric, because I would define it as an emerging paradigm, if you will. I don't, there are components in it that kind of refer to it as an architecture, but it's emergent and it's new. And that's because so much of what the data fabric needs to be valuable to those users coming to consume data or work with data, create a data culture, or data engineers that need to find data, work with data, and publish new data sets. The real key to all of this is going to be our old friend from decades ago, metadata. So metadata is really kind of at the heart of this. And the idea here is if we get really aggressive about collecting our metadata all over the place, usage, database logs, data transformations, pipelines, now we're going to have a mountain of data, hopefully in the near future, in which AI and ML models can go through that and find patterns and detect things. So the definition becomes continuous analytics on our data environment. through the use of ML, which means it needs to ingest a lot of data to train these models, and that's going to be metadata. The term that you're going to hear that distinguishes a data fabric from a data catalog, because some people will call a data catalog, fabric data catalog 3.0, will be the fact that a data catalog will go out and survey everything, but a data fabric will take that metadata and then through the use of continuous AI and analytics across it and inference and knowledge graphs will be embedded in the applications the users use to inform them. And the embedded will activate metadata for end users. And that's one of the big keys. So mainly, I think we're at the beginning of this journey and we're really 5 to 10 years out. Once again, not a new challenge. We've had a lot of challenges in data management over the years. I think the origins of this for me go back to about 2013 and the data discovery wave that we went through. And this is the culmination and setting the stage for the next generation of it. But we're always trying to solve, how do we manage data? How do we get users to actually use data? And that's what's at the heart of the data fabric.
Okay, thanks, John. And real quick, Jay or Steve, we're running a little bit behind my agenda time frame, but do you guys have anything you want to add to that definition before we start talking about these three concepts collectively?
Nothing to add.
Nothing to add, Steve?
I don't think I would necessarily. What I would say is, I look at the data fabric as really the sort of more distributed view of our modern architectures today, because we are dealing with hybrid environments and a lot more in the cloud. Even if you just go purely cloud, we're dealing with much more distributed type architectures than in years past. And so fabric is a way of looking at our or designing and looking at our architectures to be able to bring them together as something a bit more holistic. And
that's where, the fabric helps, bring together disparate data domains or within a mesh, right? And the fabric can also expose a lot of the data contracts and APIs between domains in that way. So, yeah, the fabric seems to be coming in, at the opposite direction or, as the mesh does.
Okay. So, I'm just a knuckle dragging data architect. I've been managing a data warehouse for 15, 20 years in my organization. And now I've been to Dataversity and I've listened to Bob Conway's little panel discussion on this. And I'm scratching my head going, do I need to do anything different than what I'm doing today? How is this going to help me? My business tells me I take too long, I cost too much. My solutions don't always work when I deliver them. How can I do things cheaper, faster, better? Let's talk about how any of these concepts can help me in terms of delivering that data solution to the business that can utilize it more efficiently and more effectively. Let's start with the data lake concept. If we think of the data lake as being now on this new technology where I don't have to have rows and columns, but I can have, these unstructured type things like spreadsheets and Word documents and emails and so forth. My first reaction to that is, how do I get access to that stuff? If you put 100 spreadsheets out next to my relational databases, I can't query them with, query those with Tableau or any of my other tools. How do I make that non-relational data accessible to people in sort of a portal type environment where they can pull that information together? Does anything we've learned about data mesh help us do that better? Does the domain-based, product-based approach make that any more data any more accessible? Talk to me a little bit about that. Any one of you, I'm not going to pick you in order, just whoever has a comment on that, just unmute yourself and jump in.
I think, Bob, real quick, if you go back to your quick analogy about the data lake and a library, it's just a place where you store a lot of books.
Yeah.
And you have a card catalog, and let's say you're alphabetical. It still doesn't help a user walking in that's interested in business books, self-development books. Imagine when you go into a bookstore today that there are shelves by categories. Think of those categories as domains, right? I'm going to ignore 90% of the bookstore, and I'm going to go to those rows that I'm mostly interested in. And so that kind of organization is one thing. The other thing I'd add is, if you're effectively managing your data really well, and you've got an enterprise warehouse, maybe a couple of different other databases, it's not very hard to navigate people to it. It's just that as we've got so many different independent needs of data, building more data sets and resulting data sets, it's just harder to find anything. So you have to shift to the, self-describing, how do I find something, crawlers, anything you do at scale is harder to manage. And that's not always a problem for some people.
Okay.
Yeah, I like to remind folks, and I remind myself, that functionally data lakes, for example, are no different than file systems. Performance and volume aside, that's what we're looking at. And just to reiterate that, when this started happening about 10 years ago, I really couldn't get it in my head, because I'm the knuckle dragging data architect. My head's oftentimes inside the database, right, where everything is about structure and categorization. So when this came along, I didn't, outside of performance and volume as a staging area, which there are even issues with that, I found that, actually moving large amounts of data, say between a Windows network where you may have an SQL server, and your Hadoop environment, or even Amazon S3, that performance is sometimes not as great as people, in the end, your net performance is not as great as people think. And again, to me, it's, and I understand that I'm looking at it through a particular lens, and that lens is of someone who grew up, in a sense, on the relational data model, and that's not the approach that you take. But in terms of decision support internal to a business, you asked a question earlier about what does this mean for folks listening. It's my feeling that probably 90% or better of the folks out there with the same skill sets that we generally have, that do decision support work, data warehousing of some type, a large portion of them don't need to even care about any of this, in my view. And I've go to a lot of companies, from large to enterprise, and it tends to be enterprise, and it tends to be people who already have data as a product, not little d little p, not the way we're using it here with data mesh, but just literally, if data is your product of the company, versus you're working with integrating your CRM and your ERP and logistics systems and things of that nature to produce a data warehouse. Let me stop right there and let someone else jump in. But that's, to me, it's not. I don't really see the advantage, and I think we've learned that by this term data swamp that gets thrown around. Not even really sure if staging is the right way to go about it, which a lot of folks have done. It may even be better as a playground for data science and analytics seems to be the best value. But most of folks doing decision support inside of a company, unless you're pulling large amounts of data externally and integrating feeds that are external, you probably don't need to even care. That's just an opinion, but you probably don't even need to care about data mesh or data fabric or data lake.
I want to drill deeper into this concept of a domain, because that was really central to a lot of what we talked about from a data mesh standpoint. And Steve, if I could paraphrase you, the concept of a domain is a federated or distributed ownership and governance of portions of the enterprise, as opposed to the old enterprise model that said there's one big model and we bring it all together. It was a way of partitioning that, if you will. I want to drill down a little bit more and see what our panelists think about that idea. From the early days of data warehousing, I think we've always recognized that you can't do data warehouses as a big bang. You got to do it incrementally and opportunistically and continue to deliver value in small chunks, or people are just going to give up on it. And it seems a big challenge we've had over the last 30 years is, how do I go about chunking the enterprise? How do I use the cookie cutter to do that? in the early days, I think we had a lot of swing and a miss. People read Bill Inman too literally and said, oh, we need to do this by subject area. So let's go get everything we know about a customer, and that'll be project one. And then we'll go get everything we know about an employee, and that'll be project two, and so on. Well, that turned out to be not very valuable. A lot of things said, well, let's take a particular department like the sales organization or inventory management. Let's try to solve their problems. What data do you guys need? And we sort of did things on a departmental level. And that sort of resulted in this proliferation of data marts, if you will, and redundant, inconsistent data across the various marts. It sounds to me like domain is an alternative cookie cutter in which to cut up the organization. Is that a good way that I should be thinking about what we mean by domains?
I'd like to answer that with a question a bit. I think the answer is yes, but the original characteristics of data warehouse, one of them was subject oriented. And since we've been talking about data mesh now for 3-4 years, I have the question of, is it domain oriented and subject oriented the same thing? And I think they are, but I would like to hear someone, if they disagree, and explain to me.
I see John shaking his head. So if they're not the same, what's different?
So I would disagree in the sense that I, see domains, and the way I've defined data marts, by the way, as an area of focus for an initiative. And that initiative can be born out of a single organization. However, there are domains or data marts. Some of the ones I currently have in flight, for example, there's a finance domain, that's fine. We also have an HR domain because they're doing HR analytics. They're doing a lot of everything that they need to track with organizational stuff. But then we also have some companies that are doing digital threads, which are process, right? Lead to cash. And that entire view, or there's an initiative around Customer 360, that can become a domain itself. I've got another one where we're looking at customer attrition and we're deploying ML models, but that's the beginning of that domain because certain data sets need to be brought in, integrated, created for training, reinforcement training, things like that. So to me, a domain is a highly focused, highly governed, well-defined set of data and integration that serves a purpose. And that purpose could be a business group, a business initiative, or one of those kinds of strategies. So any thoughts?
Are domains, go ahead, Steve.
So a couple of things just to clarify, I think part of your question here, because there's a lot in your question. You got to separate out domains. You have to separate out domains from data products. Domains are a way within data mesh to segregate out ownership of data and development of new data products. Domains can be, like I mentioned, anything from a product domain, like a feature of a software product, to what we've done within the data management community and sort of extrapolated that to mean a functional area or an area within a functional area, like accounting within finance, for example, or recruiting within HR. And so we look at domains as functional domains versus product domains. But data products are really more the delivery of features within those domains. For example, we look from a data management perspective at delivering data itself. When someone asks for data, we think of, okay, what attributes of that data do you need? And then we go out and we try and find that, and we deliver it in some organized way back to the users, where data products are really more in thinking of data, an area of solving for either a problem or a solution for value, such as, I need to understand, the impact of subscriber attrition of our SaaS product, for example. So delivering data to solve for understanding what impact attrition is having on our organization. That's more a data product versus saying, give me these attributes or tables or unstructured data that I can take and then try and figure out from that what impact it's having by mulling through all the different attributes that you're delivering to me to get to that solution. And so that's
Let me
why
ask this.
yeah,
Let me
go
ask
ahead.
this, Steve. Are domains mutually exclusive and non-overlapping? Should I be thinking that a customer is in one and only one domain, or could the concept of a customer cross domains?
The concept of a customer can cross domains, obviously, because they impact a number of different domains. Now, how that customer interacts with the type of information you're looking for might be different across domains. And so, getting to, for example, we've always tried to say, let's get to a single definition of customer. And it's not so easy across an organization, and John alluded to that earlier. Some organizations are a bit more complex than others, but many of the attributes are the same. So being able to share those across domains is important, but the concept of a customer is a customer across an organization.
I'd like to, right, it sounded like you were earlier giving a separation of data product, but my original question was, what is the difference between subject-oriented and domain-oriented, not data product? And after listening to John, honestly, I still see, that was a great explanation. I still see them as the same. And Bob, you're right. The concept of subject-oriented did evolve in data warehousing, and can be much more complex today. And ideas like customer can cross subject areas, but I'm still not hearing a real clear distinction between what we think of as subject area in a data warehouse versus what domain oriented means in data mesh. It still feels the same thing to me.
Let me ask your question this way, because somebody posited it on our chat there. If we say that a concept like customer can cross domains, and the whole idea behind domains is to have an ownership associated with that, who owns customer? Is it the same organization? Is it billing? Who owns the customer domain?
Right. And that's a good topic here. Another kind of gets into another topic with data mesh. Ownership of data. I've always thought of that as who is creating and editing records. Keep it really simple, right? And for customer, and times I've been through a data warehousing project where that data governance needed to discover that, because customer records were being created by different departments and no one knew who the owner was. So this is one of my arguments against. It's really a question for data mesh. Is 90% of it outside of the decentralization is I'm asking, what is new about data mesh? These are things we've been talking about for 30 years, and we've had domain oriented teams to own application systems like CRE.
Let me jump in here, Jay. So I want to back up to that previous question that one of our participants posted, and I'm going to direct it to Steve. If customer crosses domains, functionally, organizationally, et cetera, source systems, who owns the domain of customer? Or is the customer a domain?
Well, to answer that question, Bob, I need to, I think, unravel something because we're confusing the concepts somewhat. You have to, I think, understand that data mesh was created by a software engineer, not a data management professional. We're taking the definition of what Zemek has put forward and applying our data management lens to it. We look at, we divide things in a domain from a data management level as a way to organize the data that we're delivering and for consumption. She's looking at it from the perspective of an organization and saying a domain is an area within an organization, whether it's a product area or a functional, well, we're saying a functional area, but so we're confusing the concept somewhat. Now, when we talk about customer, who owns customer, we'll call customer data, or the concept of, or the aggregation of attributes of a customer, not to get confused with the software definition of a domain versus the data management definition of a domain. It's really a shared responsibility, and that comes down to distributed governance. And when we start governing the attributes of data, and this is where, as I said, it starts getting, into a much more complex or a longer discussion around each of the four principles. The self-service data platform is the mechanism by which you discover all the attributes across the organization, or the data products that include customer. Okay. The distributed governance function is what manages and maintains all those customer attributes, I'll call it. And then and this is where theory meets practice. There has to be a centralized ownership or governance within an organization to be able to manage all the definitions or all the different attributes across the organization, in today's world, to be able to say, this is what makes up a customer, okay, within our organization. So in tomorrow's world, if you look at the way Zemek envisions it, that data platform will take care of it, because it will automatically and intentionally through AI be able to say, here are all the attributes across all the different data products we have of customer. And when you search and you're requesting data about a customer, it will bring that discovery to you automatically and tell you which data product you should consume to get that data for customer that you're looking for.
Okay, I'll take the bait. Does that suggest that in a data mesh type world, that maybe we need an alternative structure to our human resources than the traditional sales, product fulfillment, marketing, or whatever? When we find data that moves across these domains, I'm defining a word by using a word, so I apologize. When we find data that moves across these traditional functional areas, and there's disparate stakeholders and so forth, are we really suggesting we need a new organizational structure for managing data, as opposed to the organizational structure historically, which is for performing business processes?
Yeah, that certainly seems to be what is being suggested. And for example, if we use the customer example, then the customer team would deploy an API in other domains that needed customer data. That's how they would access it, as opposed to a central hub like a data warehouse or hub and spoke concept.
What do you think, John?
Yeah, I was going to say, I agree with this. And I think that the real key with the domains are, data owners, or, what's driving their initiative. I do think that, and then the key is going to be this distributed governance that works, and sharing of the information, definitions, and making that available to others. Because if you have different organizations, like, let's take the customer example. Finance will define it one way. Sales will define customer a different way, and customer support yet possibly another different way. But at that time, when you're coming into the platform, you can say, well, I understand how these are all slightly different or being used in different ways. And do I want to subscribe or leverage one of these inside of the mesh via what my understanding, that's how it's governed and shared? Or do I need to create an enterprise definition of customer? And why do I need that enterprise definition? And is it to support enterprise reporting or finance or compliance? And then perhaps there is a need for a fourth hub around customer. But usually within the domains, customer, it is a mix of multiple subject areas. That's what I'm finding, is that we do get into hey, I'm the first to pull in this subdomain for vendor or supplier into mine, but others need it, and it's not available. So I'm going to build it in mine, even though I don't want to own it, and then it might transfer in the future. So I think a lot of this, the move for us as management, is to try to manage things, but it's to be distributed and push that management down to the organizations.
I was intrigued by your phrase franchise before, and I like that idea. I think that's a good real world analogy. If I'm a domain owner for a domain, let's get away from customer for a minute. Let's talk about, let's say I have a domain like I'm a manufacturing company and I have a domain around inventory management. Okay. And my organization is deemed the domain owner for inventory management. What I'm hearing from all three of you is, hey, there's more stakeholders around the concept of inventory management than just you, Bob, who are in charge of the organization that's responsible for that. Is it incumbent upon me to then look at how inventory is managed across the whole organization and be that central guy that consolidates those requirements and delivers the product solutions?
So
am I
yeah,
merely making data available for other people to construct their own products from that? Help me understand that a little bit, John.
No, I was just going to jump in. I think Steve has a real distinction, which I agree with, the separation between domains and products and multiple products of domains. But the key is that what I found in experience is that when I would work on inventory and try to define it, and an organization came to me that says we need inventory data, and I try to do an enterprise definition, they're like, I just need it defined this way. Why are you making this so much harder to build? And so much of this domain or organizational strategy and approach is that here's how I need to work with this data. These are my definitions. And as long as I communicate that and govern that properly, this is how I'm working with the data. So everybody understands I'm not doing bad things. If somebody else wants to leverage this, but a lot of the challenge we had in EDW world was the, hey, why I just need to work with this. I need to calculate that. Why are you trying to factor in everybody else's opinion when this is what my organization needs to deliver? So it is pushing, this down and say, hey, take this broader approach, but you're going to be in charge of your own destiny. And that's what I found in the franchise models are that some organizations would put a lot of resources and people and effort into it. Some other organizations, not so much. And so, it wasn't even in maturity or even in implementation across the organizations. Everybody did it on their own, but they were also in charge of their own destiny to get the budget they needed for that, to get the resources they needed for that. And centrally, when I used to do the franchise models, I focused on standards in architecture so that we could interoperate. I focused on governance and I focused on communication. Those were the only three things I needed to manage a distributed architecture.
Yeah, and I think the part of the challenge is we're running into the difference between theory and practice, right? So what I would say at this point in time is data mesh is really a theory. It's a software engineer's view of how data should be managed across an organization without the practice of actually doing it and understanding, which I think, Bob, you're running into, and probably most people on this call run into, which is, but how do you solve for all these problems that we've encountered over the years that you can't just take a bunch of distributed organizations, have them deliver data and say, okay, the job is done because we know all the cross interdependencies of data. We understand people's requests don't just end at a specific data product, I'll call it. And you have to govern it. You have certain aspects of data that transcends across an organization. How does that get managed? There's a lot of questions in practice that we've encountered over the years and are trying to solve for and have tried to solve for, that someone like a Zamek, who really is coming from a different world, is asking all the right questions and saying, well, why does it have to be so difficult? But is positing something that all the concepts that don't really exist yet, or we've learned don't work to some extent. And so, like what John was talking about is a good example. If you look at a functional area, if you look at a what I'll call software product-based company that is more really the product organizations are more technical in nature and have all those technical capabilities, chances are they have data engineers or people that can be data engineers on staff. In a traditional organization, the different functional areas, like marketing, they have a bit more desire to manage and control and develop their own data. Whereas other areas within an organization like HR have less desire to do that, or the resources to do it. The assumption by Zemek is, oh, all the different functional areas or domains are going to want to do this. And we know in practice that's not true. You're going to have a central organization at some, to handle a lot of the data requests that these different organizations aren't going to want to do or have time to do. But the last thing I'll add to this is, one of the things that is part of data mesh that is preached is that there's no central data repository like a data lake or a data warehouse. Every implementation, every case study that I've reviewed and people I've talked to, CDOs that are implementing data mesh, have a data lake and or a data warehouse as part of that. So we can't, in our world, we a lot of times we say we feel we either have to rip and replace because if we're not doing something 100%, we're not doing it. And my message, if I can get one message across today, is it's really more, and you asked us earlier, Bob, do we need to just do it differently? What we need to do is evolve and constantly evolve to get better. But ripping and replacing isn't going to solve the problem. It just opens up new problems.
So I've heard you suggest, part of the reconciliation, the theoretical and the practical is, let me back up. The data mesh says we want to take more of a decentralized, distributed aspect to the ownership of the data and the responsibility for harvesting and garnishing and centralizing requirements and data models. Is it also a physical distribution and decentralization of the actual deployments of those solutions? In other words, do I envision, again, I'll put my hat on as the inventory manager, domain owner. Do I envision myself actually building out something physical that contains inventory data? So I've got my own ETL team, et cetera, and now I'm going to be a service that makes those data available to the rest of the enterprise? Or do you see it more of, I have that perspective of inventory management that I will govern the centralized management of that data on behalf of all the other stakeholders of inventory? I know that was a long-winded sentence, but I hope you see the distinction. Is it just a governance ownership distribution, or is it actually physical deployment of the products distribution? What do you think?
Yes. Answer your question. Yes.
Okay.
So my experience is that in the mesh, it's pretty end to end. And like Steve touched on, you have your own lake or version of a lake in there. You have whatever data models make the most sense. You're going to put that on whatever technologies make the most sense, right? What I find in some of these hubs, they tend to lean into, and the enterprise data hub concept came out about 2017 and 18, but you start to get into some of these in-memory streaming databases versus large cloud-based data warehouses. And maybe your tool chooses to write everything, or maybe they use a tool, or maybe they use a data prep tool, but each one of the organizations, to me, make their own decisions about that. Some don't care, and they'll leverage an enterprise standard or default if you have it. So, it's more about, this is how we're going to pull things in. This is what we're making. This is how we're going to share it in a kind of ubiquitous way through services. So that's some of the ones I've implemented. I mean, they'll actually pull from the other domains data lake into theirs because they didn't ingest that. And they're like, why should we? If somebody else already did, let's just access theirs. So there are some reusability and crisscrosses, but I found that the tools and the tech stack between the domains can vary depending what an organization might want to do.
And keep in mind,
Go ahead.
keep in mind that in the pure sort of data mesh, I'll call it biosphere, there are no data lakes and data warehouses and data marts. They're just a group of distributed services that are managed through a central or a decentralized software platform.
Yep.
So when people need data, they just go to this platform that they can search for the data that gives them the services that has the data in them, and they select what services they want to pull from, bring that data together on the fly, because these distributed services are run in a distributed environment, and they're
Builds and
served up.
maintains, who builds, and maintains those shared services?
Each of the domains do.
It's
So
their,
let me ask this question, Bob. So that's the people who create and manage and own the data. What about on the consumption side or the analytics side? What used to be serviced by a centralized data warehouse, now are those teams also going to provide the analytical side of data as well?
Yes, yes, and I mean they should today in some respects, and that's part of when I say evolve. That's where I think organizations do need to evolve, which is, the domains do know their business best. They know the questions that they're asking, and they should be analyzing and providing that analytic capability to the domains. But that doesn't take away from the fact that there are centralized questions that get asked. And so does a centralized data science group or analytics group just disappear because you're now moving to a data mesh? And my argument would be no, because there may not be any domains that care about those centralized questions, or a question that the CEO is asking, or the board of directors is asking. So you may need to still have that, and likely will still need to have that, but each of the functional areas should have that capability, and most do today, in my experience. Not every functional area, but in most organizations we work with, there's analytics occurring across the organization in the domains today, or the functional areas I call them today.
Yeah, that seems siloed, right? Where you have two different definitions of EBITDA existing in a company, or it's our earlier example of two different definitions of customer. Presumably with data mesh, though, you would only have one definition of EBITDA coming from that domain team that developed it, correct?
Well, from the data product that they've developed. And so that platform would provide that definition of what EBITDA was or is based on that data product that you're going to be consuming. You as a functional area or a domain may build another data product that has a different definition of EBITDA. And the consumer would need to traverse this platform or utilize this platform to then pick the service that provides the calculation, or what I'll call the feature, because that's what we refer to today, of what the calculation of EBITDA was that they're interested in.
Right.
So how do we avoid the historical silos then?
In this world, you don't. I mean, it's not.
I think the evolution then is going to be, if we implement that in whatever size company, and sometime in the future, we're going to turn around and have the same problem we had 25 years ago, which is to have a broad understanding of the entire ecosystem. And so there's
the root
Dave,
cause.
let me ask Steve to finish his thought. When I asked, how do you avoid the silos? You started to say, well, you don't. And I think you had some ellipses after your comment. So continue that thought, Steve.
Sure, and this is, and I don't want to overuse this term, but this is where the theory and the practice sort of don't mesh, to use that term very well. In Zemex's world, it's really not considered, right? That's just yes, there is going to be plenty of overlap. There's going to be plenty of duplicate data products out there potentially, but it's up to this magical software that doesn't really exist yet to be able to, through AI and through, a machine learning, be able to identify those data products that overlap, be able to give you the capability to deprecate them over time, so that if people are using a data product in in a process, that it doesn't break, so it deprecates it nicely over time, gives people the ability to change to the new service, but not access that existing service that no longer is current. But a lot of it does depend on this platform, Bob. But in Zemex's world, like I said, she doesn't come from the data management world, so she's not, in my view, considering the fact that you are going to end up with a lot of overlap and a lot of silos. But the way I think it's rationalized is, yes, but this platform would give you the ability, both in an automated and a manual way, of deprecating this overlap. And so over time, it goes away.
John, let me ask you a question. I guess part one is, have you had clients who have jumped into the pool and embraced data mesh, data fabric, and tried to apply some of these concepts and so far? And if the answer is yes, are they far enough along in that journey that you could maybe encapsulate for us things that worked and things that didn't? Lessons learned that says, here's where you gotta deviate from the book, or we started out to try this, the lessons learned is here's a different way to do it. Can you give us maybe some companies, and you don't have to mention company names, but can you give us any of the practical experience that you've seen so far of organizations trying to implement these concepts?
Yeah. So first, I'll reinforce what Steve's saying is that it's taking a little bit more of a software development approach. And the real question is, those of us in data management, can we think like software development? And we're always trying to adopt a lot of their stuff to be more agile and things like that. But our data management mindset kind of is a barrier, and it's very hard for organizations to make that shift. So several clients working on this, we are simply looking at data management principles, what we're trying to do, who's asking for data, how are we going to manage an overlap, how are we going to resolve a conflict of definitions. And we tackle those more with data management principles. And then it does come up in a conversation to say, hey, is this what a data mesh is? And I'm usually like, sorta, but let's not get hung up on another label in our industry. Let's really take a look at what you're trying to do. What are the drivers? And, for example, one of the challenges around the data products, we have some, in the one client, the finance domain, we're looking at data products that turn around and feed back to operational systems. We're looking at other products that are data exchanges that need complete dumps or sets of data, not necessary analytics and reporting, as exchanges into other platforms. So, and then we also are looking at how we're exchanging some of our raw data with other platforms. So you just take a look at, here's how we're trying to pull things in. This is our objectives. We want to do it responsibly. We want to share data. We want to make sure it's properly governed. And we go in with those kinds of principles and what we understand about distributed data management. Whether or not they want to call themselves a mesh and advertise it that way, that's okay. But, mesh is really kind of an advanced approach that I think most organizations are going to struggle with. The companies I see, we're at the early phases of that, and we're trying to leverage some of this distributed management. It's first, 1 year in, 2 years in. What we know about different kingdoms of data that we have are different lines of businesses, and we try to use virtualization to span across LOBs or maybe functional areas occasionally, but it's not a new problem, and we really just approach it with data management principles. And if they want to call it a mesh, that's up to them. You can check a few of those boxes, but I do think it's a real kind of steep curve of trying to get companies to be there in 5 and 10 and 15 years from now.
So you see it as an inevitable direction, but still immature enough that we need to learn an effective way to do it?
If I'm going to place bets, I'm going to place the bet it'll fizzle out. It's just hard for a lot of the companies that I talk to with data management and BI, DW backgrounds to wrap their heads around software-defined data architecture and everything that goes with that. So there are companies that is the only way that they can manage their large distributed environments, and it's a great fit. But I do think for a majority of companies, it makes things harder than they can handle. And so I put it in the category of interesting discussion, moves and evolves our way of thinking about data management, but If I was to say, most companies are not going to adopt it, or they're going to try and kind of revert back to things, because it's an organizational strategy, and trying to get organizations to change the way they work about certain things and work in concert is a real challenge in the companies I see.
And that's what I was going to ask you is, are you saying that you think it's going to fizzle out because A, we don't have the technical sophistication to practically deploy it, or B, our organizations are not mature enough to embrace and manage it?
A little bit of both. I don't think it's a technical thing. I think it's an organizational sophistication. A lot of requirements coming in, we can handle through, data management kind of techniques. The focus with the mesh is really organizational approach. And then, the technical that backs up and supports that organizational strategy. And a lot of companies, when it comes to that kind of organizational strategy, will feel like that's out of their control. And this is what's within my scope of control and what I can do. I can't make the other organizations play nicely with me or follow the same set of rules. So if it's an organizational initiative, then that's the most of the battle, I think.
So I want to take the last 10 minutes here and open it up to our participants here. I've been kind of keeping an eye on a lot of the chatter and sparks flying over in the chat board there. I think a lot of our participants are chomping at the bit to respond to what they've heard or put a question in there. So let me do that now. We've got a couple of dozen people on here. So what I'm going to ask you is, if you've got a question or comment, raise your hand, unmute yourself, and just verbally present your question. You can do it to any one of the three panelists, or just throw it out there in general, and I'll facilitate that. But let me open it up for discussion from folks now. Questions and comments. Not all at once. Let me.
I've been poking over at the chat and some of the comments, which were great if we can keep up with them. One of the comments, I didn't get the exact question, but somebody brought up the semantic layer, right? When it comes to semantic definition of things within different data hubs or mesh, and where is that going to live? Where is that going to come from? Who's going to own it? So I was curious if anybody thought about the, kind of semantic interpretation of the data within these different hubs or domains, how that's going to be managed. Semantic consistency is really, I think, the underlying challenge within mesh.
I think in today's world, that centers a bit more around data virtualization or distributed, federated query engines, we're calling them today. That's kind of today's solution for that. Maybe tomorrow's, who knows? But in what I'll say, sort of visionary world, you sort of don't need it, because this magic platform would do it for you. You would just like I mentioned, put a request in for type of data or answer you're looking for, and it would bring up the relevant services that you would tap to get that data. So the semantic layer is sort of a facilitator in today's world, and maybe it needs to be in tomorrow's world, and maybe that's how the platform does it in this visionary world of trying to build this semantic layer. But it's one of the big challenges we have today. In fact, it's a challenge that data virtualization vendors have today, which they've never really been able to crack, which is it works well within one or two or three domains, but enterprise-wide, you end up with so many dependencies, and you end up with such a large number of convoluted views that are dependent upon each other that it's almost impossible to manage, right? So our desire as data management professionals to create this one and large semantic layer that relates all the data together. What Len used to call the enterprise data model, I think. Is it necessary? I think we look at it today and say, absolutely. Like, otherwise, how do people understand the data and how it relates to the business? In tomorrow's world, is it necessary? My argument would be, yeah. I mean, people aren't going to change. They still have to have a semantic, we're people, we're human beings. We have to have a semantic understanding. But maybe a platform will come out that be developed that it sort of takes away that necessity of having to have this visual semantic layer out there.
Let me call upon some people here. Mark Nolte. Mark, you had a question, a remark, or I don't remember if it was a question or comment along the way, but can you restate that, and let's see if our panel can respond to it.
Yeah, I was responding to what was in the chat. Privately, I've been chatting with a couple of other people up here in Calgary. The whole topic is a little bit depressing. When the word mesh came along, a lot of us got excited, and it's devolving into a bit of a, the data lake becomes a data swamp, but data mesh becomes a data mess in terms of understanding. And I shout out to John O'Gorman. It all comes back to the semantic meaning of things.
Yeah.
So just, I'm a practitioner. I'm doing data archaeology more than anything else at the moment. I'd like to do a mesh on top of a lake and not have a swamp, but I don't have that assignment yet. I got to get the words all to mean things that people agree to mean first, and then I can go from there. I'm enjoying this. Is good. This is
hey, Mark, can I ask you a question?
Sure, Steve.
Because I think this is a good question sort of ask to anyone that's interested in a mesh or doing something different. What about a mesh appeals to you? When you say, I'd like to implement a mesh, what are the aspects of it that I guess resonate with you?
Well, just not having everything have to go through the one data warehouse team, because we know now that doesn't scale and it's always behind schedule. But how do we enable this to, again, let's step back. If we want to do a mesh and have a bunch of teams working, business with IT and data management folk working together, the very first thing we have to do is establish that semantic foundation, or we make a mess, we end up with a mess. The mesh will turn into a mess. People won't trust it, just like they squawk about the refresh time on warehouses today and changing requirements over time.
Yeah, and if I could jump in here real quick and answer some of Steve's questions about the semantic layer.
Oh, John.
Hi, Bob. Congratulations on another great conversation.
Thanks.
So the company that I'm a founder, co-founder, called Semantium, we're establishing the semantic layer upstream of the data. So to your point about connecting the language of the business to the data, we actually classify, identify, and store business concepts in a knowledge graph. And we get business buy-in by having those conversations about, let's debate about the definition of a customer separate from the way customer is represented digitally. So we take away the data aspect right away and say, if we can come up with a common definition of customer, then we can start to see how that common definition connects to the data that supports that concept. The business really likes it because it's a way to get their buy-in on some of these complicated issues, but they also get an education about a simple concept like customer is not so simple when you factor in structures. So the other thing is that in terms of facility or usability, the same dimensions that we use to classify business concepts are the ones that are found in every data warehouse I've ever looked at. So when you're asking questions of the business, like which customers bought which product at which location, at which price, with which method, those kinds of things, the who, what, when, where, why, and how of things, those dimensions are ones that are embedded and baked into data products, data meshes, data lakes, whatever happens downstream, call it what you want. So that's how we're sort of implementing the semantic layer in our approach.
Sounds like you're saying we should have a stable, logical model of our business before we try to do database design.
Yeah, and actually, I
What
go
are
back further into the
concepts?
stack. Is establish a conceptual model that doesn't that doesn't require knowledge of the data up front. So you're basically, yeah, you're doing all that work up front.
Yep.
And then you're going to connect the concepts to the data, actually to the metadata initially, and to the instance data. So when you take that 3-level view, yeah, you can get a pretty good idea, and the business can get a much better idea of how they talk about their business is how the data helps run their business.
I think we've got time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions or comments before we cap it off. I won't pick anybody, but anybody else who's been commenting along the way or chomping at the bit, why don't you jump in and pose your question or comment, and we'll let the team respond to it. Okay, I'm going to pick somebody then. Kevin, you had a few comments along the way. All of your questions got answered?
Well, I mean, I don't know that there really are answers. I'm like I said, I'm coming from the perspective of I'm a software engineer. I work with a lot of data. That's all, and I like it to be well organized and kind of. I've tried to sync. I mean, I've written synchronization solutions when you've got all these different definitions. It can turn into a mess really fast. So I guess it really does. I mean, it seems like the success of all these ideas. I mean, there are ideas that are kind of like renaming of old ideas, but then again, you know, there's new tools that as they develop, they could really make a difference and could make these new ideas work. We'll just have to see how they evolve. I don't know what else to say about it right now.
Okay, I didn't mean to put you on the spot there.
No, that's okay. No, that's
I was
okay.
just browsing
I don't
through
mind.
the comments there.
I felt like I said everything I needed to say in there, but
Okay,
because
fair enough.
Yep.
One last question or comment from anyone?
Well, I'll just throw in a quick comment. I just wanted to support what John was saying about the conceptual modeling and stuff like that. I am seeing an increase from clients requesting help with conceptual modeling, not from a data modeling perspective, but to establish that business understanding better before they're moving into new projects, which are largely around how do we modernize our architecture, you know, and starting with how do we get a better understanding of our business and some agreement. And so I've actually had quite the increase in that area of requests from clients for help.
Yeah, and to add on to John's comment, you know, I think that, and part of what I was saying earlier, you know, part of this is evolution and in reaction to, you know, over time to, you know, people's complaints and frustrations and you know, and so data lakes in part have evolved because people are just tired of waiting for a monolithic data warehouse, right? And so just get us the raw data and we can do something with it. You know, data mesh is in part, you know, some of that, which is, you know, give it to the business domains, let them have at it, and just get data to us faster. I can't necessarily say that just handing it off to domains is going to somehow get it faster to you because you still have to go through the same processes. But you know, thinking in terms of that and not just like everything doesn't have to be done one way. And I'm just going to share a very, very quick story. You know, the domain, part of what holds us up is trying to get agreement from everybody. I worked on a project a number of years ago that, you know, they were trying to come up with a you know, central view of customer. You know, what's the centralized definition of customer? And this was a large pet food manufacturer, pet store retailer in the market. And you know, the ultimate question that came down is, who's the customer? Is it the person that walks in the door that is buying the product at the store, or is it the pet? Like, who is our customer? And this discussion went on for 3 months. They couldn't come to an agreement. And that's what frustrates end users, right?
Yeah.
That's what frustrates the organization, where a lot of them say, you know what, just give me the data. I don't need a centralized definition of customer. Just get me the data. Others, like me, you know, do say, hey, we need that as an organization. And it's how we're going to be able to make sense of the data for, you know, this stratification of users. But my point is, we don't have to get wrapped up in doing everything one way, but mixing how we actually approach our data management across the organization in a way that services all constituents and maybe goes against some of the things that we thought, you know, for years have been, you know, set in stone. But so I'll leave it with that.
Any closing remarks, Jay?
No, I was going to tell Steve to look into the party role model for that, for making a pet and a person the same thing. I'll leave it.
I'd ask Roger to weigh in, but I think we're running over time here. So I just want to take 2 seconds here and say, first of all, thanks for all the participants. I thought it was a really great discussion. I don't know that we've, clarified all the questions here, but I think we pushed the ball up the hill a little bit. I hope it doesn't roll back on us. I think what came out of here is each of these topics has some intriguing opportunities, and maybe we will delve into some of these topics again in some of our subsequent meetup groups here after the first of the year. Again, thanks everybody. This meeting is being taped. I'm going to end the recording in just a second, and it'll get posted in our meetup group, within an hour or two, as soon as Zoom tells me it's ready. And if you've joined this group or joined this discussion and you're not part of the meetup group yet, by all means, go join the group, because that's how I communicate meeting announcements and post the recordings and all the other stuff. So again, thanks everybody. And sometime in December, I'll get a notice out for our January meeting. Okay. All right. Take care, everybody, and have a good holiday season. And we'll talk to you after the first of the year.
Thanks.